Okay, great. So welcome everyone to our Talmud with Rashi series, which has completed just last week the study of Makos, and we had a little siyum, lovely siyum at Surah Shishit this past Shabbos. And I want to extend a special welcome to those who are joining, getting on board as we begin the new Masechta, which is Masechta Berachot. Of course, Berachot is all about blessings. We'll talk shortly about the other subjects which are addressed in this particular Masechta. I'd like to just begin by way of a bit of intro to the study of Talmud generally. The Mishnah. Let's go even back a bit further. Of course, we are very well familiar with the Torah Shebeksav and the Torah Shebaal Peh. Now, for a long time, the Torah Shebaal Peh was exactly that. It was only transmitted orally. It was forbidden even to record it in writing. A person was always allowed to write notes for himself, a student, or I suppose if he wants to share what he's learned with a friend or something like that. But the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah, was never recorded and was never published never. For a long time, it was only transmitted orally and it hadn't been codified, but it was transmitted through the Nevi'im and through the sages in each generation. And the oral quality gave it a dynamism which the written word can never accommodate fully. And especially as we know, after the Judeo-Christians got involved and the New Testament was recorded and what we know as the Torah was translated into Greek and subsequent other languages. So the Torah was almost, you could say, usurped, or it was forcibly seized by other nations and of course interpreted as suited them. So it's the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah, which has provided and which has retained the authenticity and the exclusively Jewish interpretation of the Torah, of the scriptures. It's interesting, as we shall discover tonight and as we go further, that although the Torah Shebaal Peh has been written down, has been recorded already for about 1800 years. We'll talk about that shortly further as well. It retains, and of course, Torah literature has been printed in enormous quantities really since the printing press nearly was first invented. The first printed Jewish book in 1475 was Rashi's commentary, and since then, of course, innumerable tens of thousands of volumes, separate volumes, have been printed since then. Nevertheless, the Torah Shebaal Peh continues to retain its special quality that the Talmud is very difficult to penetrate without an instructor, without someone to provide guidance and a kind of pathway. Even today, to this very day, when we've got Sefaria, we've got Art Scroll, we've got so many resources, and it is true that Torah is accessible today more so than ever before. Nevertheless, the numbers of non-Jewish scholars who have any kind of aptitude in the Talmud is very few, very few. Okay, it may change because of the reason that I just said, the accessibility, etc. There's a lot of fascination. The Koreans love it, and many others have kind of been captivated by the brilliance or the wisdom or the holiness of the Talmud. But nevertheless, the Talmud remains predominantly an exclusively Jewish province. Okay, that is the Talmud. Let's talk about the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is the first part, the earliest part, the essential compendium of Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah. It was written, it was compiled, or redacted would be the right word, by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi around the year 200. We like to say it was the year 188. There's no real basis to fix it with that precision. The reason we like to say 188 is that it would coincide with the idea of 2,000 years of Torah, because Avraham Avinu was born in the year 1948 in our Jewish calendar. And someone to say that Abraham sort of reached his religious maturity at the age of 52, exactly 2,000 years after the creation of the world. So we say that 2,000 years of Torah, in which case that would end with Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in the year 188. Well, as I said, that's a nice idea. I'm not going to be pedantic about it, but it's useful to have a ballpark idea of when he lived and when it was recorded. The Mishnah was redacted. He edited it, he collected it. That is to say, the teachings which he himself knew, which his colleagues knew, which he had as a Masorah from his Rebbeim, from his father, and he divided the totality of the halachic teachings of Torah Shabbat. It's not quite the totality because there's such things as brises as well, but let's say the essential components of the oral Torah, by which we're referring to the halachic aspects of Torah, into 6 orders known as Shisha Siddur Mishnah. That's where the word Shas comes from. And more recently, it's become a political party, but it was and it still is used as a reference to the 6 orders of the Mishnah. Should be really Shasam, but for whatever the reason, we just call it Shas. Shisha Sidrei, 6 orders of the Mishnah. The orders of the Mishnah are Zeraim, Moed, Nashim, Nezikin, Kudshim, and Taharos. I'm not going to explain them at length, but just by way of basic understanding, because we want to talk a bit more about Zeraim, because that's what we're doing now. Zeraim is about, literally Zeraim are seeds, and it deals with agricultural law. Many of the portions given to the Leviim, to the Kohanim, to the poor, Maaser Sheni consumed in Yerushalayim, which we learned about in Makos a bit as well. Also, the all of the laws about regulating the agricultural program in the land of Israel. Shemitah, the Masechta Shvius, is in Zeraim. Kilaim, mixing species together, and many other subjects. Peah, Leket, Chichat, it's all there. Now, because those laws are predominantly applicable in the land of Israel specifically, of all of the tractates in the order of Zeraim, only Brachos, our Masechta, has a Gemara of Talmud Bavli. The others are elaborated upon it in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud of the land of Israel. This year, I mean, literally these months, some Talmid Chachamim are cracking open Shvius in the Yerushalmi, because this coming year is the Shemitah year in the land of Israel. And already now or in the coming months, it's important to make preparations, etc. So we don't have a Talmud Bavli about Mishvius. We have a Masechta of Mishnayos on the subject of Shvius. Okay. The other orders, just to sort of comment upon them very briefly. Moed deals with the festivals, also Shabbos, Eruvin, and the festivals in the course of the year, also Tanis, the fast days. Nashim deals with laws of marriage and divorce and related subjects. Nashim is women, of course. Nezikin, damages, deals with civil law, laws of torts, laws of commerce, and the like. Also laws of judgment, as the Tractate Sanhedrin. Makos, that we finished just last week, is in the order of Nezikin. And we have Gemara Bavli on each of those Siddharim, Moed, Nashim, and Nezikin, almost complete. Kudshim deals with, literally means consecrated objects. And there you have the large and quite difficult Masechta Zvachim, Menachos, and very important is Masechta Chulin. I just mentioned something interesting. I once saw that when we look in our language today, there's a tractate called Chulin. Chulin is very important. If anybody wants to get smicha, then he has to learn at least certain parts of Masechta Chulin, because Chulin deals with the laws of Shchita and the laws of kosher food generally. Many of the most important aspects are found in that Masechta Chulin. We call it Chulin, but the word Chulin means mundane or even profane, like Chilul Hashem or Chilul Shabbat or Yemos Hachol, the days which are mundane as opposed to Shabbos or Yom Tov. So Chulin, the real name for it is Shchitas Chulin. And the reason it's called Chulin is that most of the order of Kodshim deals with Shchitas Kodshim, the way in which animals are slaughtered for holy purposes, for sacrificial purposes. And then there's a separate tractate that deals with Shchitas Chulin. So what we call Zvachim is also known as Shchitas Kodshim. And what we call Chulin is in some places we find that the Rishonim call it Shchitas Chulin because they don't want to refer to words of Torah with the word Chulin. Chulin, as I said, it means mundane as opposed to the holy, as opposed to sacrificial. But to apply the designation chulin to words of Torah is considered to be unseemly. So therefore they're careful to call it shchitas chulin. But as I said, for shorthand, we normally just call it chulin. The last one is taharos. And taharos, by the way, kodshim, there are other tractates as well, but we only have Gemara on those that I mentioned, Zvachim, Menachos, and chulin. And finally, taharos deals with all forms of ritual purity and impurity, very, quite complicated, and for the most part, not part of our experience in terms of halachic practice nowadays, for the most part, with some exceptions. We've got Masechta Nidgaim and Masechta Kelim and other things like that. The one very important exception is the Tractate of Nida, which deals with a woman in her menstrual period, and that is still an essential component of Jewish life today. And again, a rabbi who has, let's say, earned that designation certainly will be expected to have some, not just understanding, but some level of proficiency in the laws of Nida and the Sechta Nida as well. Okay, that's just by way of overview. And it's very nice that tonight we're starting at the beginning. We're starting with the Sechta Berachos. And I'd just like to mention why it is that Zeraim is the first of these 6 orders of the Mishnah, and Berachos, as we mentioned, is the first Masechta in the Seder of Zeraim. So the Gemara says that there is a pasuk in Tehillim that alludes to the 6 orders of the Mishnah, and it begins with the words V'haya emunas itecha. So itecha, of course, itecha, of course, refers to Moed, the tractate. The Seder of Moed, which deals with the cycle of the year, the Jewish year and the Jewish week as well. But the first word, V'haya emunas, the faith. So the Talmud says that emuna refers to Zeraim. So Rashi explains, it refers to Zeraim because a person has to have the integrity, the emunah, the ne'emanut, to separate the tithes. Because if he harvests his crop and he has however many bushels of grain or pomegranates, how does anyone know for sure if he's giving what he should give, or if he's claiming it for himself and he's eating it, which is forbidden for him to eat, and he's obligated to give to the Kohen or to the poor, etc.? Well, to a certain degree, to a great extent, it's on an honor system. It's not as likely that witnesses will come to testify against him because it's in the privacy of his own granary, etc. So that's what Rashi says. But Tosfos says something very beautiful. Tosfos says that Zeraim, planting a tree or a crop, or something for the purpose of your livelihood, providing for your family and selling to for the benefit of others and bartering for the things that you need. Adam ma'amin b'chei ha'olamim v'zoreya. A person believes in God and then he plants. Because a farmer is dependent on forces beyond his control. If this person is a shoemaker or a carpenter or many other endeavors, he to a great extent has control. Okay, he may not have the customers and they may not pay him the wages which he seeks, but to the extent that he produces, he'll be able to sell his wares or he'll be able to sell his services. But the agriculturalist is dependent on rain and on other factors, the absence of pestilence, etc., which to a great extent are well beyond his control. Therefore, it takes faith. Not only that, but the nature of planting is you plant today and you reap not even in a day or a week or a month. It's usually later in the year. You've got to wait for the next season to see to enjoy any profitability. So there's an element of faith which is part of the experience of the agriculturalist. And as Toso says, Adam ma'amin, The person believes in the one who created the world, the Cheholamim Vizoreya, and with that faith he plants. Of course, a person can plant without faith as well, but the act of planting itself suggests a reliance on a higher authority. Again, the farmer does not bring forth the pomegranates from the tree, plants the tree and he irrigates it, etc., etc. He doesn't bring forth the olives from the olive tree. He is dependent on forces of nature to accomplish that. Okay, so that's why Zeraim is associated with Emunah, because the pasuk of Emunah Sitecha, Chosin Yeshus, etc. I'd like to have another thing as well, though. The first tractate, and the one that we're studying tonight, in the order of Zeraim, is our Masechta Brachos. Excuse me. Brachos, which could, I suppose, fit into other orders of the Mishna as well, could fit into Moed, for example. And for that matter, you might say, well, I hear about these orders. Where's the spirituality? Zeraim, Moed, Nashin, Ezekin, Kachin, Taharos. Where is this sort of relationship to Hashem? So the rabbis situated the Tractate of Berachot within the order of Zeraim, because a person who tends his field and produces a yield which enables him to live and his family to live, and it's the basis of human survival. A person who does that has to turn his thoughts to God in appreciation. So the idea of brachot that are like an essential component or a companion, let's say, to the process of agricultural yield, this is what the rabbis are seeking to infuse into our understanding, that awareness. The pasuk says, "Ma Hashem Elokecha shoel me'imach." What does the Lord your God ask of you? Ki im liras Hashem Elokecha, to fear the Lord your God. I'll just repeat the pasuk, just a few words of it. Ma Hashem Elokecha shoel me'imach. What does the Lord your God ask of you? So the rabbis say regarding that pasuk in Parshas Ekev, the rabbis say, what does God ask of you? Ma Hashem Elokecha shoel me'imach al tikra ma elemeya. A famous drash. The word ma, meaning what, hints to the word me'ah. Just put the aleph in it and me'ah. Ma Hashem Elokecha shoel me'imach. Me'ah is 100. So the rabbis say that the verse in the Torah is hinting that what God asks of you is to recite 100 blessings a day. So on the one hand, it's a nice drash, but there's something much more profound here as well. That if you think about it, what God asks of us is to be conscious of Him, to be aware of God in our daily life. If a person recites 100 blessings a day, then if he does so with an awareness, even though reciting a bracha takes only a moment, really, most of the blessings that we recite are very short. But by so doing, a man or a woman for that matter invites God into his world. What does God ask of you? Something which is on the one hand profound, but at the same time very accessible, very achievable. Doesn't cost to say a bracha. I'm talking about a bracha on food, for example, or drink. It doesn't cost. There's no out-of-pocket expense. It doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't require a great deal of skill or expertise. It doesn't inhibit a person in his lifestyle the way many other mitzvahs of the Torah do. Either they demand certain things of us, or they put off limits behavior which may be very attractive or very tempting, or maybe we have to try hard to avoid. Brachos have those benefits, and maybe that is why this is the first tractate in the Talmud, because this is the subject of our Masechta. Is the path, is like the portal to invoke and to invite the presence of Hashem, the awareness of Hashem into our lives. And because we all need to eat, and it's something that we do every day, and there are other occasions, of course, where we say brachos as well, it's something which becomes readily part of our lives, part of our daily experience. Okay, let's talk about our particular Masechta. It has four, generally speaking, has four subjects. Four broad subjects are taken up in this Masechta. As well, of course, I know we've got some Talmudists here for certain. Some have been with us in Makos, and no doubt others studied other Masechtas as well. So we know that the Talmud is always discursive. That is to say, it will go from one subject to a related subject, to a tangential subject, to a further subject. Sometimes after learning a page or half a page, we might need to remind us of how we got onto this subject, how the Talmud sort of meandered off into that area. So although these are the broad subjects which are taken up in this tractate, many other subjects are addressed as well, as we shall find. So the first couple of chapters deal with, the 3 chapters deal with Kriyas Shema, the reciting of the Shema, the blessings of the Shema, when to say it, how to say it, whether one can interrupt in the course of reciting the Shema, how to say it in terms of the pronunciation, also the posture, sitting, standing, lying down. Tefillah is the next subject, prayer, especially the Amidah. The next subject is Birchas Hanehenin, blessings about food, bracha before we eat, bracha after we eat. Also, we have the laws of washing hands before eating bread, and of course Birkat Hamazon, which is, by the way, the only bracha which is explicit in the Torah. There's another bracha, Birchas HaTorah, which is hinted to in the Torah, is Min HaTorah according to many authorities, but the only bracha which the Torah itself mandates in terms of a mitzvah among the 613 mitzvot of the Torah is Birkat Hamazon. Even what we call the Amidah, which is the quintessential tefillah, according to really all authorities, is Drabanan. Even the Rambam, who holds is D'Oraisa, it's only in certain circumstances, and it's not the formulation is only Drabanan for certain. In any case, that's the subject of tefillah. Then we said the subject of Birchas Hanehenin is the third subject, and the fourth subject is blessings of things that a person sees or experiences, a blessing of hoda'ah, appreciation, or if you see a shooting star, or if you see a comet, or if you see a rainbow, or if you see or experience an earthquake. Not that it's something to look forward to, but all of those occasions and many others will warrant a bracha, and the Gemara talks about those. So those are the four subjects, broad subjects taken up in our Masechta. Okay, how does it begin? So maybe you have your tractate with you now. So let's take a look and see the first words. Me'ei Masai koren es shema ba'arvin. Me'ei Masai is the Aramaic for mimatai, from when. Emasai is the Aramaic for when. Me'ei Masai, from when. In other words, what is the earliest time to recite or to recite Shema ba'arvin at night? When is the earliest time to recite Shema in the evening? Now, we're here in London in nearly the height of the summer. Most of the year, when we are having this year or whatever you're doing at 8 o'clock or 8:30, it's dark out. But of course, in the summertime, that's not the case. And I'm just looking out the window here. It's not quite broad daylight, but there's plenty of daylight still around. So the time to recite the Shema is not determined by the clock. And that's true, I guess, partly for the obvious reason they did not have clocks in antiquity. But we'll see shortly the basis for the answer to the question, when should the evening Shema be recited? Okay, very good. Thank you, Dr. Schmidt, for calling up the words here on the screen. With thanks to Safarian. So you can see on your screen, and maybe you have the tractate in your hands as well. Me'ei Masai koren Shema ba'arvin. From what time, meaning what is the earliest time, from what time in the evening does the mitzvah of reciting the nighttime Shema begin? Now, why does this tractate begin with the subject of Kriyas Shema? It's almost tangential, really, to the subject of Berachot, because although there are blessings that we say on the Shema, we say Shema in the morning, and there is a blessing, 2 blessings before, and there's a blessing after the Shema in the morning as well. But as we shall see, and of course, you may well know, if you think about it for a moment, The formula of the bracha is not asher kidishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al kriyas shema or the kro shema. We don't have such a formulation. Many other mitzvahs, there's a bracha that we recite, lahadik ner shel Chanukah or lishmoa kol shofar, or many others. The kvo mezuzah, and so many other mitzvahs. Alachilas matzah. We always have the formula asher kidishanu b'mitzvosav. We were sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us al nitilas yadayim, for example. But although reciting the Shema is a mitzvah, but the sages did not formulate a bracha which addresses the mitzvah explicitly. Rather, they like couched the mitzvah of the three paragraphs of the Shema within two blessings before and one bracha after. We may have a chance to discuss one tonight, but about those brachos. So we do have brachos that are associated and they appear in the Siddur and they are part of the contextual mitzvah of Shema, and yet Shema itself really stands alone in the sense that it's not a bracha, it is a mitzvah that is stipulated in the Torah. So I think we could definitely justify or explain or anticipate that the place for this mitzvah to be discussed is in our Masechta Brachot, because we said already it's about blessing, it's about tefillah, it's about prayer, and Shema is part of that general experience. But why does it begin with Shema? Why does our tractate begin with it? So one answer could well be, and I want to mention a few considerations, and certainly they can all contribute, they can all be part of the answer, part of the explanation, and perhaps I'm sure there are other reasons, and maybe you would consider my reasons to be less than compelling. But in any case, one thing is that it's a mitzvah in HaTorah. I said before that of the brachot that we recite, only the blessing of Birkat HaMazon is min HaTorah. And it's logical to start with something like when we talk about blessings on food, let's start with the blessings before the food, and then we'll talk about the blessings after the food, which is exactly what we do in the sixth parak, when our tractate deals with that subject. So to begin with Birkat Hamazon after we eat would be probably, I would say, a counterintuitive place to begin. Moreover, you only say Birkat Hamazon if you have mazon, if you have food, or if you have bread. If you have food which is not bread, then there is a bracha to be recited, but it's not Birkat Hamazon, the three blessings that are, again, expounded upon in our Masechta. We'll learn a lot more about it as we go along. But that's only if a person has food. And, it's only on those occasions. So the rabbis may have chosen, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who arranged the Mishna, may have chosen to start with the mitzvah of Shema, because it's applicable to every man. It's not applicable to women, but it's obligatory for every man, every day, twice a day. Again, there may be some exceptional circumstances where a person may be absolved from that obligation, but it's not dependent on any particular day of the year. It is dependent on a certain time of the day, and that's our subject, Me'i Masai. From when do we begin the Shema at night? Of course, you might wonder why start with Shema at night? Why not start with Shema in the morning? Of course, the answer to that would probably be because we know that in our tradition, the day starts with the night. So just like Shabbos begins in the evening, so every halachic day begins in the evening as the sun sets. That's the arrival of the new day, even though we think of it as the end of the current day, but that's where it starts with Kriya Shema Shel Arvis. Moreover, the nature of the mitzvah of Shema, in addition to the fact that it's applicable to every man and it is applicable every day, of course, the nature of the mitzvah touches upon the essence of our belief, of our faith. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. There's one God. And although we Jews have been saying that and telling the world about it for 3,000 years, at the time when it was, when God revealed himself on Har Sinai, it was a great novelty, and it took a long time, probably well over 1,000 years after that, probably 1,500 years after Matan Torah, before it became quite widely accepted that there is a God in heaven, as opposed to multiple, a plethora of gods, polytheism and heathen, idols that existed as in the ancient world. So the confession of faith, as it's called, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, is the essence of the Jewish faith. It's the basis of all of the rest of our observance. It's the essence of who we are as a people. And therefore, the recitation of the Shema, I think, is a very natural, is a logical place to begin the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah. For those who were with us in Masechta Makos, just last week, or possibly the week before, we learned that famous statement, the idea of encapsulating the essence of the Torah in one principle, Tzadik be'emunaso yichya, the righteous will live by his faith. So therefore, I think we can certainly marshal a strong case to explain why the mitzvah of reciting Shema is the first mitzvah. I'd like to finally mention one other idea. It's a bit too clever for me to have thought of on my own. I remember learning it, but I can't remember where. What is the first word in the Torah Shebaal Peh? Here in our Mishnah, the first of the tractates, in the first Seder of the Mishnah, Me'imasai code. From when? What is the first letter? So you see it right there on your screen. Me'imasai. Me'imasai is the letter Mem. So you might wonder, wouldn't it be nice to begin with the letter Aleph? And there are some Mishnayos, probably some Prakim as well, I'm sure there are, that begin with the letter Aleph. Or you could say maybe begin with the letter Beis, like the Masechta begins with the first page is the daf Beis, and of course the Torah begins with the letter Beis. But my friends, there's a very beautiful logic to why Torah Shebaal Peh starts with the letter Mem. And that is because the Torah, the 5 books of the Torah, end with the letter Lamed. Of course, it begins with a Beit, it ends with a Lamed. Asher asa Moshe le'enei kol Yisrael. So we know about drashos that link together the last letter of the Torah, the Lamed, and the first letter of the Torah, which is the base for Leiv. But once we finish the Torah Shebiksav, we go on to Torah Shebaal Peh. So the letter Mem here follows on from Leinei Kol Yisrael. And if you say, which would be a valid observation, that Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah, is not limited to the 5 books of the Torah, to the Chumash, we also have the Nevi'im and we have the Ketuvim as well. So you might say a person would not necessarily proceed from the last words of the Torah to continue right away to Torah Shebaal Peh. He first needs to study also the books of the Nevi'im and Ketuvim, and I think that is a valid observation. So what is the last letter in the whole Tanakh? The last letter, the last words of the book of the last book in Tanakh. So according to the order that was recorded, Sidon Shobsuvin, the Gemara Baba Basra tells us the order of the scriptures. The last book is called Divrei Hayamim. We call it Chronicles in English, and that book ends with the words Hashem Elakav Imo, God is with him, Vaya'al, let him ascend, Vaya'al. Vaya'al, you can hear it in your with your ears. It ends with the letter Lamed, Vaya'al, just as the Torah itself ends with the name called Yisrael, Vaya'al, let him ascend. So again, we go from the Lamed, which is the last letter in Torah Shebiksav, in scriptures, in the written Torah, and we proceed now to the letter Mem, Me'emasai, current as Shema. And I hope you'll forgive me for the extended introduction. I think it's nice to have a bit of orientation, especially because we now have the merit, the schut, of learning Masechta Berachot together, which is the first Masechta in the sequence of Torah Shebaal Peh. So let's get to it now without further delay. Me'emasai, current, and not that we were delaying, we were doing the introduction. So we've done the intro, let's get to our subject. Me'emasai, current as Shema Ba'arvin. From what time does one fulfill the mitzvah, or is it proper to recite Shema at night? Now, there's the implication that before that time, either there's no point in saying Shema, or there's nothing wrong with reciting the Shema. These are words of Torah, but one does not fulfill his obligation in reciting the evening Shema if he does so before the time, because but the time will be defined right now. That's the Mishnah. Me'emasai Koran Shema ba'arvin. From what time does one recite the Shema at night? Misha shehakohanim nichnasim lechol b'trumasan. From the time that the Kohanim enter, means they come home to eat their truma. Ad sof ha'ashmora harishona. So the earliest time is when the Kohanim come to eat truma. They come home to eat truma. We'll see where they've been and why they don't eat truma at any other time. Why is it particularly like describing how late in the evening before they eat truma? We'll get to that in one moment. And the time to recite the Shema extends until Ad Sof HaAshmora HaRishona. The night was divided into 3 watches. So if we imagine a day, not like today in the middle of June, but a day in Nisan or in Tishrei, where the night and day are approximately 12 hours each. In fact, there may be a day when they're exactly 12 hours each, but let's work with that. So if the night is 12 hours from sunset to sunrise, and of course, as we know, in the winter in London, the night is much longer than 12 hours. But we know there are some times of the year where it's close to that sort of equipoise. So if the night is 12 hours, then each watch is 4 hours. So if the sun sets at 6 p.m. and the sun rises at 6 a.m., then according to this Mishnah, the time to recite Shema would be from when the Kohanim come to eat their truma until the end of the first watch, which, if we're talking about equal segments, would be 4 hours, which would be about 10 p.m. if sunset is at 6 p.m. Which means that later at night, you miss the chance to say Shema. The mitzvah of Shema has to be within that time interval. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer, but that is not the consensus view. That is the view of one of the sages whose teaching is recorded here in the Mishnah. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. The sages maintain ad chatzos. They give him more time. So chatzos would mean, according to our very simple example, where the sun rises at 6 p.m. and it sets. The sun sets at 6 p.m. and it rises at 6 a.m. So chatzos would be midnight, which in any case chatzos is close to midnight, except if we've got British summertime when chatzos is about 1 a.m. or 1 p.m. But if we put aside the sort of artificial adjustment of the clock, then chatzos would be close to midnight. So the Chachamim say until midnight. The first opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, he would say about 10 p.m. And chatzos would be the midpoint between sunset and sunrise. But there's another opinion as well. Rabban Gamliel Omer ad sheya'ale amud hashachar. The time for the nighttime Shema extends all the way through the night. Ad sheya'ale amud hashachar. Until dawn arrives. Ad sheya'ale amud hashachar. So 3 opinions. And in terms of how long until when it extends. According to Rabbi Eliezer, only the first third of the night. According to the Chachamim, half the night. According to Rabban Gamliel, you've got the whole night until dawn. You can say Shema. If you didn't say Shema earlier, you can still fulfill the mitzvah of the nighttime Shema. Maaseh, now the Mishnah, was not so common in the Mishnah to elaborate or provide some narrative background to these opinions. We find it in the Gemara not infrequently. The Mishnah tends to be very terse and very economical in its language. Here we have a bit of elaboration. Maaseh uva'u banav mibeis hamishta. It once happened that his sons, the sons of Rabban Gamliel, they came home mibeis hamishta from a party. Probably it was a wedding. Normally it means a wedding. But literally, mibeis hamishta means drinking. So they were possibly intoxicated, or at least the drinking caused them to neglect reciting the Shema, into the night. They came home late at night. Amru lo, they said to him, lo karinu es Shema. We just realized we haven't said Shema yet. Amar lahem. So Rabban Gamliel said to his sons, Rabban Gamliel probably was up learning, but they were out partying. Okay, he said to them, Im lo ala amud hashachar. Take a look outside. if it's not getting light yet, if the dawn has not yet broken, chayavin atem likros, then you are still obligated. You can still fulfill the mitzvah, and you're obligated to fulfill the mitzvah. If you haven't done it yet, you know, you've neglected it, but do it now while you can. So from here we see a proof or an illustration maybe of the view of Rabban Gamliel. It doesn't prove that he carries the day, but we see here at least an illustration of the fact that he had the strength of his convictions. He was of the view until dawn. It once happened, his own sons came home very late. He said, if it's not yet dawn, you're obligated to recite Shema, the nighttime Shema. Just by the way, cast your minds back to December or January in London, and you will recall that when we daven Shacharis at 7 a.m., it's very dark when we begin, and sometimes it can even be dark when we end. We might finish at 7:45, but the sun doesn't even rise till after 8. So you might wonder, at 7 a.m., it's possibly before dawn. So is that a time for the morning Shema or the nighttime Shema? It's a good question. We may have a chance to discuss it. It won't be tonight, but it's actually a valid question and an interesting possibility that a person could wake up in the morning, not even exceptionally early in the morning, let's say 6:30 a.m. in the winter, and he can still say the nighttime Shema, not the bedtime Shema, the nighttime Shema, if he didn't say it the night before, for whatever the reason. And that is actually would actually be the case. Question is it possible that at a certain time a person is able to fulfill the mitzvah of the nighttime Shema and also the morning Shema at that same time? Something to ponder. Okay, v'lo zu bilvad, and not this alone, meaning not only the mitzvah of Shema, and here we're right away going to see an example of how the Mishnah can also go from one subject to a related subject. We're going to find right away, right now, in our Masechta Brachos, some laws which are only tangentially related, but the Mishnah is going to take them up, like we say, derech agav, because of going on to a tangent. So having established the possibility, more than the possibility, but the view of Rabban Gamliel, that the mitzvah, the nighttime mitzvot can be fulfilled until dawn, having established that, the Mishnah is going to say, "V'lo zu bilvad omru." Not this alone have they said. You've got a pretty good eyes here, better than mine. Not quite good enough. Anyway, it's around here. My cursor. V'lo zu bilvad omru ela kol ma she'omru chachomim ad chatzos mitzvasan ad sheyale amud hashachar. All of the occasions, all of the mitzvahs about which the Chachamim said that the mitzvah should be performed until midnight, mitzvasan ad sheyale amud hashachar. Actually, the mitzvah applies until dawn. And this is a general statement, and this is true halachically as well. Really, the machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabban Gamliel is not nearly as striking as we thought. We thought the Chachamim said until midnight, and Rabban Gamliel says until the morning. But Rabban Gamliel actually agrees that it's proper to say it, to recite the Shema until midnight. And not only that, but all mitzvahs that should be done at night should preferably be accomplished before midnight. But in actuality, the mitzvah is still applicable and can still be fulfilled until dawn. Let's take a look. The offering up, the burning on the altar of chalavim is chalev, certain types of fat of the animal, which the Torah does not allow a Jewish person to consume, but they were placed, those parts of the animal placed on the altar to be consumed by the altar. If we're talking about sacrificial flesh, in terms of chulin, so the chalev is simply removed, and we don't consume it. It's forbidden to eat chalev, but it was part of the rite of the sacrifice. Was hekter chalavim ve'evarim, and also when it comes to a korban ola, certain limbs of the animal were also placed on the altar through the night to be consumed, to be burned up on the altar through the night. So those as well. Mitzvah sanat shiyalemud hashachar. The mitzvah is to fulfill them until dawn. and everything that should be eaten in one day, meaning the day that it was offered and the night that follows, but not beyond, not on the following day. And by the way, when it comes to Kodshim, the night follows the day. So even though we very well know that in halachic terms, generally the night precedes the day. So like a fast day, we talk about Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av, those fast days that begin at night, they begin the night before. Once it gets dark on the day of the fast is over. But when it comes to Kodshim, when it comes to Kabbanos, then the day of the offering extends into the night. So when it says you can eat it on one day, but not the following day, you can eat it and you can eat it until midnight and really until dawn. Let's take a look again at it. Whatever can be eaten for one day. The mitzvah applies, meaning one is allowed to consume that meat until dawn. So therefore, why did the sages say until midnight? If really it's generally agreed that the mitzvah is applicable and may be fulfilled until dawn, why do they say until midnight? In order to keep a person far from sin. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I would like to do the Rashis on this Mishnah. We don't necessarily, for those who are joining our show, we don't necessarily do every Rashi. Frequently we don't, but it's worthwhile doing the Rashis on the Mishnah at least. Possibly next week we'll have a chance to do some of Tosfos as well. Okay, let's start at the top of Rashis. Just want to mention, Yaakov, if you want to make me smaller and make the image larger, people might find that more convenient as well. Just as possible. If you've got the Gemara in front of you, that would be even better. But if you're relying on the image on the screen, then there was less of me and more of the page of the Talmud, might be a good idea. Yeah, okay, if you enlarge it, that's great. Okay, so we are looking at here the Rashi's here on the right hand side. Meimasai Koren es Shema ba'aravin. From when does one recite the Shema in the evening? Mishasha konim nichnasim lechol trumasan. From the time the konim enter to eat their truma. So Rashi explains kohanim shenitmeu. We're talking about a kohen who had become tamei. Doesn't mean he become tamei mate. That would be a serious problem for a kohen. I mean, it could happen, inadvertently. But even if he's not tamei mace, even if he just came into contact with a nevela, a dead animal, or a sheretz, a rodent, or something like that, or even if he simply touched maybe a young child, maybe his own child who had been playing in the field and again may become tamei, so the kohen would have to take special care to avoid or at least to respond to such a circumstance. He's allowed to become tamei in that way. He hasn't transgressed, but he may not eat teruma. Teruma is the special portion given to the kohanim. A non-kohen may not eat teruma, and a kohen is allowed to eat teruma. That's part of his privilege of being a kohen. Also, many times the kohanim did not have another livelihood. They did not own land, and they were not agriculturalists, and therefore they actually were dependent on the teruma for their own consumption, and that of the members of their household as well. If a kohen becomes tamei, then he has to immerse in the mikveh, and he remains tamei until the evening. That's the point of it here. Take a look at Rashi. Kohanim shenitmeu v'tavlu, and they have immersed. The ha'eriv shimshan, and the sun has set. V'higia itam lechol betruma, and the time for them to eat truma has arrived. So one would often in ancient times see a few kohanim coming from the mikvah in the way home in the evening. Now they could immerse in the mikvah earlier. They could immerse in the mikvah anytime during the day, but they only become tahor as a result after the setting of the sun as well. I should say they're only allowed to eat teruma after the end of that day when the sun sets. So it was often the case that the kohanim would immerse towards the evening, so that when they came out of the mikveh, the sun would be setting, and they could go home to eat truma, and they would be in a state of tahara. Because if he immerses in the mikveh at midday, who knows what could happen in the course of the day? So therefore, it was like common occurrence that the kohanim would come home to eat just as the sun was setting, because that's when they have been purified from their tuma, and that's when they can eat. Um, so that's how the Mishnah identifies the time for the evening Shema, which would be sometime shortly after sunset. Now I have to mention again, we're here in the midst of the middle of June, near the very peak of the northern hemispherical summer. I mean, quite far to the north. Uh, in the land of Israel, and again, if you recall visiting Israel, then you are aware that the sun sets much more quickly, which means two things. It sets earlier. So if the sun sets here in London at, let's say, 9:15 or almost 9:30 tonight, in Israel, the sun sets maybe even with the summertime. I think maybe the latest sunset is possibly 8 o'clock or 7:30, something like that in Israel. You can Google it to see what the greatest of these. So the sun sets earlier, but it sets faster, by which I mean the interval between the setting of the sun and the nightfall is much shorter in Israel. In the land of Israel, maybe 25 minutes, maybe even less, is the whole interval between sunset and nightfall. It varies slightly winter to summer, although again in London it varies more substantially winter to summer. The interval, how, so to speak, quickly the sun sets, and that has to do with astronomical phenomena. So, of course, the Mishnah was dealing with the circumstances in the land of Israel. So if the sun set again at 6 p.m., then by 6:15 it was pretty much dark. By 6:20, definitely you could see the stars twinkling for sure. So if they came home after the sun set, within a few minutes, that's the time that's nightfall, and that's the time for reciting the evening Shema. Let's go on in the Rashis. Ad sof hashmura harishon, until the end of the first watch, of which there are three. Shlish halayla, a third of the night in the Mefarish Gemara. Umisham ve'elech, from that time onward. So this is the view of Rabbi Eliezer, who is stringent. He says the latest time is only the end of the first watch. Says Rashi, it's the last wide line in Rashi. Umisham ve'elech avar zman delo mikri to Zman Shechiva. After that, it's too late because it's no longer called Zman Shechiva. Now here, Rashi is referring to how we even derive this idea that there is a time for the Shema. Why can't you just recite Shema anytime you want and fulfill the mitzvah? Because the Torah says, Asher b'shachbacha uvekumecha, when you lie down and when you rise up. So when you lie down means that the time for reciting the Shema is at the time that people lie down, at the end of the day. So the beginning, the earliest time is shortly after sunset, when it gets dark. That's when people begin to get ready for bed. The latest time, says Rabbi Eliezer, under normal circumstances, is only a few hours, maybe 4 hours later. So if the sun sets at 6 p.m., by 10 p.m., nobody else is going to sleep. They're all sleeping already. Of course, in modern times, that may well be different, but the Mishnah here is reflecting the operational definition of a shachbacha when you lie down. So Rabbi Eliezer says only until that time. And before that, before nightfall, which we say is shortly after sunset, it's also not the time for lying down, because if the sun is up, you should be working. People are out and about. Of course, a person might take a nap or might not be feeling well, but the norm is that a person retires for the night only after nightfall. Therefore, someone who recites Shema earlier than that, earlier than this time, May Masai, he's not fulfilled his mitzvah. Now Rashi asks a question. So why did we even say Shema in Shul? Which it seems they used to daven Mariv before nightfall. It was the norm to daven Mariv. When I say they, I don't know about the people in the Mishnah, but in Rashi's time and place, they would frequently daven Mariv earlier, before this crucial time of nightfall. In Cain, Lama Korin Osabaves Knesset. Why do we recite Shema in Shul? Before in what we call Ma'ariv, why is Shema even included then? Why she says because we want to begin the Amidah from the context of words of Torah. So we say Shema See a few things after that as well, but then we say the Amidah, we recite the Amidah. This is what it says in Yerushalmi. We'll see next week. Tosos has a different view of the matter. Therefore, the obligation is to recite the Shema from after it gets dark. Says Rashi, if you recite Shema on your bed before, that is to say, bedtime Shema, one paragraph, that's enough. That's how you fulfill your obligation. Now, again, we'll see Tosos does not agree, and the Achroni maintain that what we keep talking about tonight for the last half an hour, Kriyas Shema, reciting Shema, it means all 3 paragraphs of the Shema. Probably Me'ikar Hadin, the basic essential obligation is just Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Baruch Shem, a person should say as well. That's also part of it. The rest of what we call Kriyas Shema is probably well, again, it's a machlokas, but it may only be drabanan. It's not so clear. Some hold all 3 paragraphs, or the first 2 paragraphs, or the first paragraph of this is daraisa. It seems that Rashi holds the first paragraph because Rashi says clearly, just take another look. Uva parsha rishona shalom karei mitaso yotza. Time is up. We'd like to end on time, so hopefully we will take up we'll do the rest of the Rashis next week. They're not that difficult and they're illuminating, I think. Besides which, it's nice to learn the first Mishnah. I won't say we're learning it with the most depth possible, but we'll try to learn it thoroughly, and we'll set the stage for our understanding the Gemara that will follow B'ezras Hashem next week. So thank you to everyone. Thank you especially to those who have signed on, or at least commit yourself long term, but have joined us tonight. And again, kol hakavod to our Talmudists who have studied together Masechta Makos, and we're looking forward to further adventures together in Masechta Berachot. So thank you to all.
Thank you very much.